Good morning, everyone. Today is Low Sunday, or Quasimodo Sunday, from the introit of today's Mass, Quasimodo Geniti Infantes. And we're going to discuss doubt, disbelief, and the pagan and Jewish bits within Christianity today. For those of you watching 10 years from now, today's date is April 16th, 2023. So, why is this important, and why am I going to talk about this before we get back to the Magic from the Ground Up series, which I'm going to resume next week? Because many of us watching this identify as Christian magicians. Our belief system, it is either within Orthodox Christianity or with some variant of Christianity, with greater or lesser degrees of affinity towards Catholicism or Orthodoxy. Mostly Catholicism, because that's what I've been representing ever since day one. So it's important to have an idea, what are the components of the belief system? Why do so many people tend to fall from Christianity? And what is it that makes Christianity such an implausible system? So much so that even the New Testament in St. Paul's epistles, he acknowledges it. He acknowledges it even 2,000 years ago. We're going to have a look at that today. And hopefully this will help you not just in your practice, in your spiritual practice, but it should even help you in your day-to-day life in navigating your belief system, not just the what I believe, but why I believe it, and just help you in your day-to-day life. That's my hope. It can also help undergird the foundation of your practice going forward. I know that when I came to this realization, I started coming to this realization last year, as I started meditating on it more and more, it has helped me immensely. Let's move forward. The reason I talk about doubt and disbelief today is that the gospel for today's Sunday, it is a week after Jesus comes back from the dead. The apostles all saw him, except for Thomas. Actually, give me one moment. I want to get you the citation. This is John 20, 19 to 31. All except for Thomas. And Thomas says, until I see him and press my finger in his wounds, I'm not going to believe it. This is the origin of the term doubting Thomas. So he doubted. Jesus came back and said, okay, do it. Put your finger there. Thomas did. He goes, my Lord and my God. He believes. And Jesus says, blessed are you who have seen and believed, but blessed even more will be those who have not seen and believed. And that's pretty much why I tend to preach about doubt and disbelief on this day. Can't really use the word preach. I have flash right back into when I was in ministry. Old habits die hard, don't they? So, why do so many people doubt Christianity? So many people who are born and raised Christian, why do they doubt it? Why do so many non-Christians find it difficult to believe? Well, this is not a brand new thing. It's not a brand new thing at all. St. Paul in his epistles, this is where I should have looked up chapter and verse. St. Paul in his epistles, he said, the cross is a stumbling block to the Jews and a folly to the Greeks. So he already said these people have a problem. So Jews and pagans alike. He used the term Greek as a general purpose word for pagans. He actually separated them out into Greeks, meaning civilized people, and barbarians, meaning the northern tribes, be it the Germans or the Scythians or whomever. People outside the Hellenic sphere of influence, or the Helleno-Roman sphere of influence. So it was a stumbling block. People had a very hard time believing it. Generally speaking, the people that it caught on amongst during Paul's lifetime were the lower classes, the slaves, the laborers, the people who were neglected by the rest of society. And in fact, we see this with literally every new religious movement in every society. It usually if a religious movement catches on, it usually catches on amongst those who are dispossessed by society. It catches on there because the people who are in the establishment of society, the people who are in the elite of society, they're getting what they need. If a movement catches on, it is saying something, it is addressing those people who are not getting what they need. It is addressing questions or concerns that are not being addressed by greater society. And it found a point of complaint, and that's where it sticks. That's why it tends to catch on amongst the lower classes. We saw this too, maybe some 250, 300 years prior. I forget the exact timeline. In the Vedic religions, there were a number of small p Protestant movements moving against Hinduism. The two that have survived to this day are Buddhism and Jainism. They protest and their biggest protest, and this is how they caught on, was a protest against the caste system. Right? It was the Varna Dharma, I believe it's pronounced in Sanskrit. Their protest was against the caste system. This is also how Christianity caught on in India. They appealed to the untouchable castes because they were casteless religions in a system that had a caste society. So we see the same thing apply in a very different culture, in a very different mindset. The new religious movement caught on because it addressed questions and concerns that the established society did not address. Yet for those that are in the established society, it's very easy to laugh at it, to ridicule it, or to disbelieve it. I have belabored my point for far too long. So for us to be Christians in a predominantly Christian society, it's very easy to lose belief because the reasons that the original believers had for their belief, we don't have those same reasons. We don't live their lives. We don't live their lives. We don't necessarily have their concerns or their fears. We don't necessarily have their needs. We don't have the need for the same type of hope that they had a very felt need for. The culture is different. The mindset is different. We live in a different time, not necessarily a better time. Not necessarily better because all times in history have their pros and their cons, but it's definitely a different time. So it helps us to go in order to analyze our belief or disbelief. And for me, this quest began, 12 years ago. I was a very devout Catholic, even when I began Columbus Chapel of Faith Ministries, and that was the scariest thing for me, leaving the traditional movement, because it was so indoctrinated into my head, so beaten into my head that if I am leaving this movement, I am leaving truth. Truth with a big T and a capital Ruth. That's how ingrained it was. I was scared. And I've talked about this before. I think it was in my Vicennial address, my Vicinalia. Well, I talked about this. But once I stepped through that fire, I was free. But once I stepped through that fire, once I overcame that indoctrination, that created a downward spiral. And one day, and this was when I made the final move in 2009. And in 2011, I am in the church. I'm about to turn on the air conditioner. It was like a hot day. 2011 was a fairly hot summer. It was a hot day. I believe it was in September. We still had temperatures of about almost 100 degrees. I'm flipping on the air conditioner an hour before church begins because I want the building to be nice and cool when everybody shows up. And it just occurred to me, why the hell do I believe this? What the hell is wrong with me? Actually, it was August. I'm sorry. It was August. I know this because my best friend's wedding was September 3rd. I officiated that wedding, and it was a few weeks before then. This is when I learned that her husband-to-be, who was raised by a priest, was openly professing atheism. He wasn't much help. That's another conversation for another time. He was too ideologically invested in anti-theism to be of much help. But it's a total another subject for another time. In fact, he and I have talked about that, so I'm not talking behind anybody's back. I'm not triangulating. Why did I believe that? I struggled with this. And I told myself before, if I ever stop believing, I will still preach, because even if I don't believe, I will be able to help people who do. So I went through the motions. I knew any sacrament that I confected would be valid, in spite of my personal beliefs, because that is the teaching of the church. So I went through the motions for a while. I would never say I was actually an atheist. I would never go that far. I would say I was questioning. I would say I was doubting. And what kept my faith was signs and wonders. I've talked about this before too. I will tell you it's okay to ask for signs and wonders. It is okay to ask for physical real-world results. But it wasn't until last year that I was really able to analyze it. All the theologizing, all the philosophizing in the world is not going to solve the problem. And me, in my heart of hearts, I am a skeptic. I am a skeptic. I would define my approach as semi-rationalist. Like I said, I am a skeptic. I am an empiricist. Just believing on blind faith, deontological morality, never questioning, these are things that I have always condemned in the strongest terms. And you have heard me say this here before, consistently what I said when I was at the pulpit. Blind faith is for fools, and the worst possible temptation is that of not thinking for yourself. I bring deontological morality into this because deontological morality is morality based on duty. It's a morality based on obedience. Do the gods forbid a thing because it is bad, or is a thing bad because the gods forbid it? Teleological morality says the former. The gods forbid something because it is bad. It is inherently bad, therefore it's forbidden. Deontological morality says a thing is bad simply because God said, no, thou shalt not. Well, a thing is not bad because an empiricist will say a thing is not bad because it is decreed as bad. A thing is bad because it is inherently bad in and of itself. So we flip the script, and that leads to teleological morality, which is the moral system that is taught by the Catholic Church. Even if deontological morality is what's preached from the pulpit, what's taught in the seminary is not what is taught at was preached at the pulpit. That's another big thing that can lead people to lose their faith. That inconsistency there. There's a pulpit level knowledge and there's a seminary level knowledge. And the twain, they're not always one and the same. They really aren't. The fact that most people, the rank and file pew sitters, are there just to hear the thou shalt not, to hear the moral teaching, and could care less about anything beyond that superficial level, that causes a lot of people, especially those people's children, to lose their faith. And so my struggle was not the struggle of the rank and file believer. My struggle was of the person who actually knew their faith, who actually knew the ins and outs of their faith. And it's like, this shit's way too philosophical. What brought me back was the empirical. I ask for signs and wonders in prayer. I get signs and wonders in real life. That's what brought me back. I had a blog post, how occultism saved me from atheism. And then last year, there was a post in the Catholic and Orthodox Forum where a member said, Christianity is the religion of the Logos. Therefore, to be anti-Christian is to be anti-Logos. It clicked. That is what got me on my current trend. That's exactly what got me on my current trend. Because when I look at the formulations of Catholicism as they are written, especially the formulation of extra ecclesiam nulla salus, outside the church there's no salvation, there are just too many word games. And I want to define what I mean by word game. Anything other than plain speech. If it requires excessive nuance, it is a word game. If it requires excessive explanation to get the other person, in order for the other person to understand it, it is a word game. If it requires too many distinctions for the person to understand it, it is a word game. Anything other than A to B to C. Plain speech. That's it. And extra ecclesiam nulla salus is not plain speech when you explain it along with all of its exceptions. It has more holes than Swiss cheese. And the average non-Catholic, you cannot explain it without using the word ignorance several times. The average non-Catholic hearing this is going to think you're calling them ignorant. People don't like being called ignorant. Pro tip, they don't like that. You don't like being called ignorant either. I can guarantee that. I certainly don't like it. So they will think you're calling them a name, most people. And in conversation, the way conversation works, when you call somebody a name, or if they think you're calling them a name, it will create conditions of a mental shutdown that you can keep talking. And even if they agree with your points after that, there will be a blockage that prevents them from assimilating those points. Dale Carnegie talks about this in enough detail to be useful in how to win friends and influence people. Keep that in mind, put that on the back burner. I'm coming back to it later. So we're going to get past this stumbling block today. So we go back to the gentleman who mentioned Christianity as the religion of the Logos. That's what clicked. The Logos is the rational principle that orders the universe. The salvation is in alignment with the Logos. And this is not unique to Christianity. But the moment I saw that, and I had already been veering towards that, in an interview on Logos of Ophiel back in 2019, I think that's where I first mentioned it. Christianity has both the prophets and the philosophers. Christianity is superior to paganism because we have the prophets. Christianity is superior to Judaism because we have the philosophers. We have both. I have said in recent broadcasts, Christianity is the via media, the middle path between Judaism and paganism. And the Logos being the rational ordering principle of the entire universe. As that ordering principle, the entire universe automatically transcends Judaism or paganism. But since both Judaism and paganism have access to truth by way of natural revelation, and what supernatural revelation they may have gained. In Judaism's case, through the prophets. In paganism's case, natural revelation through the philosophers. This is why paganism is the other Old Testament. Then the Logos must speak to both on some level. It must speak to both on some level. And as we see this through a logocentric lens, I hate using that word lens because all the rabid ideologues who use it, but it is accurate today. If we see this through logocentrism, we then get to see Christianity in terms, not only as a via media, but also in terms of its pagan components and its Jewish components. And we can see what each of those components do. They actually balance one another out. And then it becomes easier to overcome doubt and to overcome disbelief because we're breaking the religion down to its components. And we can ignore everything atheists say about the talking snake, which we really don't believe is a physical fact anyway. It's a total straw man. It's a total straw man that's used to imply a no true Scotsman argument. And I won't even say atheists, I'll say anti-theists. Because most atheists could care less what you believe or what you don't believe. As long as you don't act like an ass to them, they won't act like an ass to you. And everybody can get along. It's the anti-theists that have this axe to grind, for whatever reason. And there are as many reasons as there are individuals. I refuse to pigeonhole every member of one group into one box. I refuse to do that because that will always lead to false expectations and false realities. So if we break this down to the pagan components and the Jewish components, we see two things. The first is that the pagan components of Christianity tend to elevate the religion towards the heavens. The Jewish components of Christianity tend to hold back the religion down to earth. And they balance one another out. You have heaven and you have earth. And by pagan components, I should be specific. Because when polemicists or anti-Christians claim Christianity is pagan, they actually crack me up because the examples they pick are always wrong. They don't know a damn thing of what they're talking about. Christianity is pagan because this or that practice was baptized into Christian folk usage. Yeah. And you know what? Probably so is your grandmother's lasagna recipe. Lasagna comes from the Romans. The tomatoes were added later and all that, but the base recipe, laganum, comes from the Roman Empire. So, yeah, that could be called a pagan practice that Christians later did too. You're simply doing what your family did. You're preserving the tradition of your ancestors. And considering that a recipe is a morally neutral thing, there's nothing wrong with this. Pre-Vatican II Catholicism said, okay, so what? The pagan elements tend to be the best bits of pagan philosophy that were absorbed into Christianity, the Logos. And since the Logos is mentioned in the Bible, John 1:1, en archein o Logos, in the beginning was the Logos, in the beginning was the Word, we are on solid ground. We see the assimilation of pagan philosophy in the Bible itself. We also see that with the idea of an everlasting hell, which does not exist in Judaism. So we cannot deny this. And the pagan bits tend to elevate the Christian religion up towards heaven. The Jewish bits tend to restrict the religion towards earth, and they balance one another out. If we took away the Jewish bits, we would have the centrality of the Logos, the virtue of religio, which is the virtue of right living and right relationship with the gods, and the transactional principle of do ut des, which we see most clearly in sacramental theology, in the principle of ex opere operato. If you use the right form, the right matter, and have the right intent, then the sacrament will take effect. It will be valid. You do your part, God will do his part. If we take out the Jewish bits, that's what we have. If we take out the pagan bits, we define in the negative. There will be no Trinity. There is no Trinity. There is no everlasting hell. And the entire religion would simply be an expanded version of Noahidism. And the reason I say no Trinity, for those of you who aren't aware of this, if you read any Jewish polemic against Christianity, anytime a Jewish writer attacks Christianity, their entire discussion begins and ends with the Trinity. The Trinity is wrong. The Trinity is shutfus, assigning partnership with God. They take a special exception to the divinity of Jesus, or they use the term avodah zarah, which translates strictly as strange worship, has overtones of idolatry. Strange worship or foreign worship. The overtone is idolatry. Prior to the Tosafos school of the 17th century, Christianity was considered idolatry because of the Trinity. So you don't get any discussion about the sacraments. There's no real discussion about Christian soteriology. There's no real discussion about any of the stuff that we consider the meat of the religion. It's just the Trinity, most of them. the Trinity is wrong, therefore the rest of the religion is not worth discussing. That is how most Jewish polemics operate. And in their mind, it makes sense. It totally makes sense. They're right. It makes sense to begin and end with the Christian idea of Hashem. And so what I say is, it would just be Noahidism, the 7 Noahide laws, which are incorporated into Christianity. The Acts 19, we see this at the Council of Jerusalem. This is why Christians are not required to be circumcised. This is why Christians are allowed to eat pork. So that's a Jewish bit. In fact, the one positive Jewish bit that is at the center of Christianity is love thy neighbor. Paganism does not have that charity towards thy neighbor aspect. This is why I accuse modern neo-pagans and Reconstructionists, actually revisionist pagans, I accuse them of simply following a cultural mindset of late 19th to mid 20th century liberal Protestantism with Jesus removed and their gods and goddesses added on. Because if you look at them, they always follow typically a liberal or left wing, and there is a difference between liberal and leftist, a liberal or leftist politic, and that whole charity towards the neighbor thing is central. We actually, and the pagans themselves admitted this. They admitted this in the 4th century. Julian the Apostate, when he tried to revitalize paganism, when he was not the last pagan emperor, that was Anthemius, who was Anthemius in the early 470s, 100 years after Julian. But when Julian tried to reestablish paganism, he established pagan charitable networks because he saw 2 things. First, that Christianity's strength was in its charity and its giving to the poor. And second, paganism just does not have charity at its core. Because paganism, especially philosophical paganism, is a religion of the sublime. Philosophical paganism seeks the sublime. It seeks theurgy. It seeks becoming like unto God. It seeks divinization. It seeks theosis. And these are the pagan bits that became incorporated. Not the animal sacrifice, not the base superstitions, but the higher philosophical aspects. As I said, this is why when people try to defeat Christianity in general or Catholicism in particular by claiming this pagan practice, I laugh. Especially when they say the veneration of saints is pagan. I'm like, have you read what the pagans themselves said about the venerations of saints? It freaked them the hell out. It disgusted the hell out of them. They were very quick to say, nope, not us. Not us. This is all them. The pagans themselves are very quick to say, so no, we know that the veneration of saints is not a pagan practice because the pagans themselves told us so. The Christians made this up all by themselves. This is exclusively Christian. So that door that especially is used by Protestant and Reformed Protestant polemics is totally closed. But this actually goes to my next point. Christianity contains pagan bits and Jewish bits. It's a via media, and that creates a tension. The pagan bits lead to the sublime. The Jewish bits are what lead us to the emphasis on the word, the emphasis on the inspiration of the Bible, which could lead anywhere from the Bible that God inspired the parts that pertain to our salvation, at minimum, to the view that the Bible is inerrant and infallible, even in the word choices of the authors, which God dictated through automatic writing. That's referred to as plenary verbal inerrancy. So the emphasis on the book, the emphasis on the inspiration of the book, that is a Jewish bit of the religion. The emphasis on physicality, the emphasis on history, that's a Jewish bit. Whereas paganism didn't worry that much about it. Okay, yeah, we believe in our gods, but we don't necessarily believe the myths were factually true. And so there is that tension. that tension that exists within Christianity. And various thinkers of various times have tried very hard to resolve that tension. That's why we have the debate about infallibility versus inerrancy regarding the scripture. That's why we have that debate about the Jesus of history versus the Christ of faith. And when we realize the Jewish and the pagan bits, when we realize the tension that is there, it can help us with our belief or disbelief. And we also realize why some people have become Judaizers while others have become paganizers in their attempt to reconcile it. And most people try to reconcile this unconsciously. If we look at it in terms of the centrality of the Logos, the virtue of religio, and the transactional principle of do ut des, do you know what happens? We don't need to worry. I am not denying anything here. I'm just simply saying it is not as important to us to defend anything like biblical inerrancy or even the physicality of Jesus' resurrection, because rather than focusing on an event in history, what we do is we focus on the eternal principles. And the only thing that matters is, do these eternal principles work for us now, in the present day, in the current year, on this day of April 16th, the year of our Lord 2023, or do they not work? That is the only proof we need for our beliefs. Do they work or do they not? The Bible, rather than becoming this hill that we need to die on in order to defend our faith, it becomes a helpful guide that helps us. Now, I'm not saying the Bible is not true. The Bible is very much true. I'm not saying Jesus didn't come back from the dead. He very much did come back from the dead. I believe this. I will defend this. What I'm saying is, if one focuses on the pagan bits rather than the Jewish bits, they become less concerned with the physical aspects of it. And the focus becomes on the spiritual, on the sublime, on the operating principles behind the universe, rather than on, did this event not happen in the Near East 2,000 years ago? However, what you lose potentially is all grounding in reality. Because you're so focused on what is lofty, you may lose the grounding in what is here and now. The Jewish bits keep us grounded in what is here and now. Now, and what we see, however, has been excessive Judaization. When I refer to paganization or Judaization, I'm referring to going one way or the other away from a central balance. And we have to equate the fact that the average Christian does not understand Judaism and does not understand paganism. So these elements are, so the average Christian has no context for understanding these elements that we're talking about. They only understand them in the context that they grew up hearing, which is not how Judaism or paganism would have approached these. Now, if we go towards the Jewish bits, we find ourselves very much here in the physical. We find ourselves in a moral Christianity as a moral system rather than a spiritual system. Reformed Christianity is the perfect example of this, because Reformed Christianity, under Zwingli and Calvin, it consciously and categorically rejected everything that the founder saw as, quote, pagan or as, quote, idolatry. And it very consciously chose to stick to the Jewish bits as much as possible without renouncing the Trinity and becoming Jewish themselves. This is why we find in fundamentalist churches, this is what I believe is the root of Christian Zionism. This is what I believe is the root of Hebrew Christianity that we see in some churches, that they try to become as Jewish as they can while still being able to call themselves Christian. Because Reformed Protestantism has a strong Judaizing tendency to begin with, and it starts with the founders. So in that, That's why Reformed Protestantism, it does not have a system of spirituality as much as a system of piety. It does not have a teleological morality, but it insists on deontological, a duty-based morality. Remember, in Judaism, the primacy is law. Judaism does not have an official theological doctrine. You have the Rambam's 13 points, which is probably the closest thing you'll get. But there's no official doctrine. You have the Shema, you have the 613 mitzvahs, you have the law. That's it. That's the closest thing you have. It's a religion of practice, not a religion of doxy. Reformed Protestantism assimilates this by deontological morality, duty-based morality, which can lead their thinkers to some pretty uncomfortable conclusions when they contemplate certain commandments given in the book of Numbers. And rather than a spirituality, it's a piety. It's a network of responsibilities. And I don't have a book. I actually have a book that talks about this, but it's in the other room. It's navigating a network and a web of responsibilities. Your responsibilities to others. It's a web of relationships. So this is how Reformed Protestantism serves as an example of the Jewish bits while excluding the pagan bits as much as possible. It becomes a very social religion. It becomes as actually, Chris, I hope you don't hate on me for mentioning this. Chris Bellardi, okay, the author of The Red Church, when he was studying for the priesthood, he actually did his, I don't know if I want to call it internship, but he did his assistant pastorate in a combined Lutheran and Reformed church in eastern Pennsylvania. You have these, they're called unionist churches or union churches, where Lutherans and Reformed will set up in a shop. He was training with the Lutheran branch of this church, and he ministered in the Reformed church. Actually, I got to meet the Reformed parishioners and the Reformed pastor when I was there at his ordination. I also got to meet Silver Ravenwolf's former best student. The second time I got to meet one of her students. That was very interesting. Anyway, what he said to me is, in contrasting the two, the Reformed are very humanistic. Those are his exact words to me. And he was describing how casual they were about the sacraments, which it does make sense, seeing that their interpretation is symbolic rather than real presence. It'd be considered real absence or substantiation. It's very physical oriented. And this is why Reformed theology, because it does not have the balancing element of the pagan emphasis on the lofty, this is why Reformed theology is what led to social gospel. It led to the progressive movement, which came from the New England congregational churches in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. It came to a lot of your left-wing social movements traced from Reformed theology, because the emphasis was on relationships. It was on the physical without the spiritual. So it was love thy neighbor without the balancing principle that paganism brings to the table. Whereas a Christianity that is exclusively on team pagan, which tries to eliminate the Jewish bits as much as possible, can become very cold. It can be very, very, very individualistic, very about the individual ascent, the individual theosis, and it can ignore charity to one's neighbor. It can become very cold. It become very inward turned. It can become very not engaged with the world. So at one end, you have lack of engagement with the world and a lack of balance, a lack of grounding. At the other end, you have an overgrounding and over-engagement with the world, but no real ascent, no real going above and beyond, no real transcendence. And to me, the pagan and the Jewish bits in Christianity, they also represent a dual nature of God. The Jewish bits can be symbolic of his immanence, the pagan bits of his transcendence. And what helped me with my faith, I'm not going to lie to you. I am more or less on Team Pagan. I am more or less on Team Pagan. I do favor the pagan bits. But you know what? My ancestors marched with Caesar. Some of them were probably at the fall of Alesia. Some of them were probably there. Were probably there at the fall of the rest of the triumvirate. My ancestors marched with Caesar. My ancestors probably marched with Marius. My ancestors saw the restoration of the empire under Aurelian. And my ancestors were probably on both sides of the Diocletian and the Decian persecutions. So, gee, I'm going to side with my ancestors. Yes, I'm going to side with my ancestors. Part of honoring your ancestors means acknowledging them. All right, that's fine. But my point is, one thing that will help you in your faith journey, overcoming your doubt, is figuring out, is it separating the pagan and the Jewish bits, and then figuring out, is it the pagan bits that are giving you the problem with your belief, or is it the Jewish bits that are giving you the problem with your belief? In my case, I firmly admit it. It was the Jewish bits that were giving me the problem, and it's not because of Judaism. It is not because of Judaism. Judaism is a separate religion. It is because the emphasis on making the physicality a hill to die on, making the truth of the biblical account a hill to die on, making the physical truth of the resurrection, which we cannot empirically prove one way or the other, a hill to die on. Making the historical truth of the story a hill to die on. That's the stumbling block for me. I cannot prove this one way or the other. And so if I make this a hill to die on, that it has to be true, it's going to keep questions in my mind. Why am I bothering with this? But if I focus on the eternal principles that are true, regardless of whether the story is true. Now, for you personally, you may find yourself on Team Jew. You may find yourself more comfortable with the story and with the charity towards the neighbor. In fact, one thing that turns most people off to Christianity is the constant preaching about loving your neighbor and then the complete lack of it in practice. That's what turned Julian the Apostate off to Christianity. He was raised Christian. He's called the Apostate because he chose paganism later in life. What turned him off was he saw the hypocrisy that happened amongst Christian congregations. That is the big thing that turns people off. It turns people atheist, or it turns people pagan, or it turns them Buddhist or Hindu or whatever, or New Age or whatever other religion. The big thing. Christianity emphasizes charity towards neighbor, which is why Christianity grew so big in the early days. Why Christianity grows so well in non-Christian lands. It addresses concerns society was not addressing by helping the lower and the neglected classes with food, with shelter, with charitable, tangible things. But when we talk about it in our own countries, we see the complete hypocrisy in our own congregations. Now for you, if you are more comfortable with the Jewish bits than the pagan bits, you may be somebody who actually lives that charity and actually lives that aspect of faith. And that will help you overcome your doubt or your disbelief. So I'm winding and I'm rambling, but I want to bring this home because my point here is that the best way to overcome doubt or disbelief is to break it down, not necessarily pagan versus Jewish, but by some system of categories, and figure out what elements of Christianity that are appealing to you, that keep you here, And what elements are there that are uncomfortable for you or may even be repulsive for you? Figure out where you fit in that spectrum. Figure out where you fit in the spectrum. And in fact, other than the love thy neighbor, which gets so often neglected in our congregations, you see, I admit it, I don't emphasize charity in my practice. Charity keeps me grounded. Love for my neighbor keeps me grounded. And I do emphasize it in a way. I don't emphasize it to the point of losing all self-interest. I don't emphasize it to the point of giving everything of myself or laying down my life. I don't. Because quite frankly, if you die today, what good are you going to be able to do tomorrow? So I look at it in terms of limiting principles. I also look at charity in the case of a hand up, not a handout. So for me, it's a balance. It's a balance. How can I help a person? How can I help a person overcome their current condition without putting them in a position of dependence? How can I help them become independent? Because I value independence. I value freedom. Remember when I said the pagan bits favor transcendence? I value transcendence. How can I help a person become independent and become transcendent? That is my idea of charity. I do not emphasize the modern idea of charity, which is basically make people dependent and don't teach them how to become independent, whole, functioning adult human beings. I focus on becoming grown-ups. That may have turned a lot of you off. That's fine. That's fine. But I see it as balance. I would rather see a community of functioning grown-ups rather than a community of children. And that requires a balance between the elements. That requires the via media being lived in as much balance as possible, which I try to do in spite of my tendency to skew towards one side or the other, and which we all should do in spite of our tendency to skew towards one side or the other. The focus on the logos is what should guide us. And this brings us to the other issue, which now that I've explained that, I can actually discuss this part in full. Another thing that turns people off to Christianity is a doctrine of extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside the church, there is no salvation. I think a really good example of this that sticks out in my mind is a gentleman who's been on my friends list, who may or may not end up watching this eventually. And he's not the only person I know who participates in both Judaism and Buddhism. He's not the only person I know. For some reason, I seem to have Jewish friends that are also active with Buddhism. I'm not sure what the appeal is, but I know there is a definite appeal between the two faiths. And I say more power to you. What he says is the reason I am not a Christian is that Christianity teaches everybody who is not a Christian is going to hell. This is a misunderstanding of the doctrine of extra ecclesiam nulla salus. It's a misunderstanding, and it's a very common misunderstanding amongst Christians and non-Christians alike. And it cannot be explained without word games. Remember when I mentioned this earlier in this broadcast? A word game, I define it as anything other than plain speech. Plain assertion A, which leads to plain conclusion B. A plain direct route. Anything other than that is a word game. Over nuance, over explanation, over distinction. And the risk of being misunderstood. With that in mind, the formulation of outside the church there is no salvation. It's a very difficult one for people to swallow. Catholics as well as non-Catholics. It's a very difficult one. And it's also extremely misunderstood by people on both sides. Why is it misunderstood? Because the emphasis on the word church. A person who is not a member of the church is not saved. That's why. It's very easy for people to say, oh, not a member of this group. And this is why I have previously proposed a formulation, outside the logos, there is no salvation. Not only as an alternate wording, but as a superior wording, because it says everything that extra ecclesiam nulla salus is trying to say. It accounts for all the exceptions of extra ecclesiam nulla salus, all of them. But it also is worded clearly, it's worded plainly, it's a direct assertion, and it does not have any of the baggage associated with the term outside the church. It does not require any of the workarounds or loopholes or explanations that extra ecclesiam nulla salus has, and you don't risk insulting the person that you're talking to while you're trying to explain it by using that word ignorance. I'm going to do a quick run through of what I'm talking about here. Outside the church, there is no salvation, but there are exceptions. The very first exception we see is in the Bible itself. Romans 2:11-15. Paul tells us that for people who do not have the law, if they work with the law of God that is in their hearts, then they too can find salvation. It's just that simple. And that's actually an application of Noahidism. This is how Judaism says that non-Jews can be saved. The Jewish doctrine of the righteous Gentile, which is a direct parallel to the Catholic doctrine of the noble pagan. They're pretty much one and the same. So the noble pagan and the righteous Gentile may be saved by doing the best they can with what they have. In fact, the Noahide laws was also referred to in the Talmud as the 7 laws. We see this in Sanhedrin, I think it's 59a, I probably got the citation wrong, where they talk about, may a Gentile study Torah? And the position that comes about, actually this is also the Rambam's position, I believe it is Hilkos Malachim. The position is the middle ground between extremes. One rabbi says, a Gentile who studies the Torah should be treated as a high priest. Another rabbi says Gentiles who study the Torah should be killed because they are stealing our property. And the third rabbi gives the middle position. A Gentile should be allowed to study Torah insofar as it applies to the 7 laws. If they wish to study more, they should not be stopped. And the different schools of Judaism today, they take different positions. But the 7 laws are considered the natural laws that one can find just from observing nature. Don't murder, have laws in courts of justice, don't steal, no sexual irresponsibility, no cruelty to animals, no blasphemy against God. It doesn't mean you have to believe in God. You don't have to believe in God at all. Just don't blaspheme against God. That's the Noahide laws. And that's the foundation of how a non-Jew can be saved. That's also the foundation of why converts from paganism do not have to be circumcised in order to become Christians. Transfer this to extra ecclesiam nulla salus. The Noahide laws, which lead to Paul in Romans 2:11-15, that if somebody who doesn't have the law does the best they can with what they have, God will look upon them and can save them. God may save them too. We then get into the church. Around 1140 or 1141, a local council at Sens. This is in Denzinger 388, DZ 388 by the older numbering. I don't know the newer numbering, the DS numbering, because I don't use it. They were referring to a priest who somehow was ordained without first being baptized. The priest died, and one of the bishops made a request to the council. should we offer prayers for this priest who turns out wasn't baptized? Should we offer prayers for this man? Should we hope that he was saved? And what the council says, even though he was not baptized, he persevered in faith. I'm just going to summarize this. You can read the whole thing at Denzinger. Baptism is administered invisibly to one who not contempt of religion but death excludes. In other words, this man, he didn't hate religion. The only reason he couldn't be baptized was that he died first. He died first before this mistake was discovered. And read Ambrose. Ambrose says the same thing. So yes, you should join in prayers. You should have sacrifices offered to God for this. In order to have prayers and masses for this man, for the repose of this man's soul. Since if baptism is administered invisibly, then he made it into heaven through baptism of desire. He was not baptized physically. That means he was not technically a member of the church. But outside the church, he was, because he aligned himself with the Logos. Keep that point in mind too. Pope Innocent III has a very similar thing to say. A Jewish man who baptized himself. This is in 1206. He is responding to the Bishop of Metz. The baptism itself is not valid because the man tried to baptize himself. You cannot baptize himself. You cannot baptize yourself. There has to be a person who is initiating you and then the person who is initiated. Baptizer and baptized. Self-baptism does not exist. Catholicism does not recognize self-initiation. We'll put it that way. But he also says, so the man was not baptized, the man was not a member of the church. But if he died immediately, he would have gone automatically into heaven because he aligned himself with the faith. All right. Now we have a much fuller explanation in 1854 in Singulari Quadam from Pope Pius XI. It is necessary to hold for certain that they who labor in ignorance of the true religion are not stained by any guilt in this matter in the eyes of God. So, if you're not aware that Catholicism is true, if you're not aware about needing to be in the church for salvation, and most people are technically ignorant of this. This is the word gaming here. This is the word gaming. They're technically ignorant of it. God doesn't hold it against them. They can still go to heaven. Now, who would arrogate to himself to mark the limits of such an ignorance? Because of the nature and varieties of peoples, regions, innate dispositions, and so many other things. So how do we know? How do we know what God's going to demark as ignorance and not ignorance? How do we know? We don't. He's outright saying we don't know where the limits are. And I am belaboring this point for a reason. I'm belaboring this point for a reason. For in truth, when released from these corporeal chains, we shall see God as he is. Scriptural citation is 1 John 3:2. We shall understand perfectly. We shall understand perfectly then. But as long as we are on earth, it is unlawful to proceed further in inquiry. You can see the whole thing at Denzinger. Denzinger 1647. DZ 1647. In other words, the Pope says that as long as we are here, as long as we're here in the flesh, we don't know who God's going to let into heaven and who not. And it is unlawful to try setting the limits. We don't know. We only know that those who labor in ignorance, as he puts it, that's the buzzword here that sets a lot of people off. Those who don't know the Catholic Church is the true church, God's not going to hold that against them. God is not going to hold their, quote, ignorance against them. That's all he says. We don't know where the limits are. We don't know who God's going to say yes to and no to. And in 1863, he speaks to, I believe he was speaking to the bishops of Italy. He says the same thing. It is known to us and to you that they who labor in invincible ignorance, there's that buzzword again, who zealously keep the natural law and his precepts engraved on the hearts of all, and being ready to obey God, to live an honest and upright life, can, by the operating power of divine light and grace, attain eternal life, since God, who clearly beholds, searches and knows the minds, souls, thoughts, and habits of all, because of his great goodness and mercy, will by no means allow anyone to be punished if they don't have guilt of deliberate sin. So again, he's expanding this a bit. If you're not doing it on purpose, God doesn't hold it against you. If you were trying to do the right thing with the best that you have, and this is DZ 1677, you can read it there. If you're doing the best you can with what you have, God is not going to say, no, you can't get in heaven, you're automatically in hell, whether you're technically a member of the church or not. And the reason I am quoting from these is I am making a case that this is purely pre-Vatican II theology. There is no post-Vatican II gobbledygook involved in any of what I am saying here. This is strictly, straight up, solid traditional Roman Catholicism. Every word that I have just quoted to you. Now this is where it gets fun. I didn't print it out on my notes, but 1947. In 1940s, actually the 1940s, Feeneyism. Feeneyism is a movement that's endemic within the traditionalist Roman Catholic movement. And it takes the Councils of Constans Ferrara, actually an offhand comment from the Bull of Reunion with the Armenians and the Copts, and takes it overly literally. If you are not baptized by water, everything I described just now is baptism of blood or baptism of desire, where a non-Catholic can be saved. Feeneyism teaches that if you're not baptized by water, if you're not in union with the church in life, then you're automatically going to hell. Non-Catholics go to hell, period. That's Feeneyism. That error, that strict interpretation of extra ecclesiam nulla salus, Feeney got into trouble. Actually, it was for disobedience, but this became a controversy. And his ordinary, his bishop, Cardinal Cushing of Boston, corresponded with the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. The Inquisition responded back to Cardinal Cushing in 1947 and basically said, Feeney is wrong. This is what the church teaches. This is what the church teaches. Right? Feeney is wrong. And they basically just repeated to him everything that I just read to you. So it is very, very clear that the doctrine of extra ecclesiam nulla salus has more holes in it than Swiss cheese, A. B, that the church and the scriptures have always said that a non-Catholic or even a non-Christian has a way of getting into heaven. And C, that the proposition of otherwise is condemned. The common misunderstanding, exactly what my friend said, that the idea that non-Christians automatically go to hell, that proposition is condemned by Christianity itself. So what we see here is that extra ecclesiam nulla salus is not only faulty wording, not only is it bad wording, not only is it misleading wording, I believe that it should be dropped and avoided altogether. The main issue here is that extra ecclesiam nulla salus, this is one of the Jewish bits inside Christianity. It is the holdover of the chosen people mentality. Christianity basically believes that God chose the Jews to protect and preserve the primitive revelation and the prophecies of the Messiah. But that the moment Jesus died on the cross, his special chosenness for the Jews ended. That it ended. And the Jews basically became equal with everybody else. That's how Christianity views the whole chosen people thing. Now, we see this changed in Reformed Protestantism, especially the Christian Zionist branches. Obviously, because they are obsessing on the Jewish bits without understanding Judaism while ignoring the pagan bits. The pagan bits are that the Logos is the central principle that every person has access to if they align themselves with it. This comes specifically from Stoicism. Now, extra ecclesiam nulla salus is a direct chosen people, is a direct derivative, not inheritor at all, is a direct derivative. The Jews were chosen, now the church is chosen. The church is the new Israel. The church is the new Israel that should cover the whole world, but right now does not cover the whole world. This gets into some scary historical parallels that I'm not going to discuss right now. But the problem is, the moment you have a chosen, a mindset of chosen, and this is a thing we find in tribal religions, and we have to understand Judaism started as a tribal religion with 3 very clear steps. Yahwism, which was the original tribal religion. It was the original tribal religion, most likely henotheistic, which is why the earlier books of the Bible constantly talk about people in Israel turning to other gods and condemning them. Yahwism. After that, with the return from the first exile, Judaism. Judaism, which is where we have the return with Esdras and Nehemiah and so forth. There were elements incorporated then from contract with Zoroastrianism. See, Judaism itself has its paganizing influences from Zoroastrianism and Hellenism. After the Judaism that developed after the Maccabees. After the Maccabean revolt, even the Maccabean leaders themselves started to have a limited degree of Hellenism. And this actually bodes ill when Protestants try to focus on the Jewish bits, because their misunderstanding is they want to believe first century Judaism was pure and free of all pagan influence. It was not. It was not. Think what you will of David Bentley Hart. There's an article where he calls this out very clearly, and he's right about it. Even Judaism in Palestine was Hellenized to some extent. So Judaism itself had paganizing influences through Zoroastrianism and Hellenism. In fact, Jewish mysticism, I've been told, it incorporates Neoplatonism. It incorporates it. Now, I'm no expert on Neoplatonism. I'm not going to discuss that one way or the other. My point is, extra ecclesiam nulla salus is an appropriation of the chosen people ideology of Yahwism. In Judaism itself, there were universalizing tendencies. That's why there was pushback against it. There were universalizing tendencies as Judaism itself started to mature during the intertestamental period. In fact, we actually see this. Dr. Menahem Kellner talks about Boomer orthodoxy, which tended towards that universalism. We can even see this in the writings of the Rambam. I believe, was this also Hilchos Melachim? I'm not sure, so don't quote me on that. Was Hilchos Melachim or was Mishnah Torah? I don't remember exactly. Where the Rambam said there is no distinction between the soul of the Gentile and the soul of the Jew. Universalism. So we actually have this trend inside Judaism. We have that as well. And we actually have to keep that in mind. We have to keep... This exists alongside a trend within Judaism that only Jews have a neshama, or Gentiles have a neshama, the rational part of the soul, which separates the human from the beast. It's cognate with the Catholic spiritus. The rational part of the soul, or that Jews may have 2 neshamas. One is the regular neshama, and the other one that helps the Jew keep the law. So there are actually theories around this too. I don't want to get into that because it's very easy to interpret. It's very easy. I don't want to get into that because then I have to deal with the problem of anti-Semitic interpretations. I have to deal with perversions and misunderstandings. And I don't want to get into that. And I really don't want to enable that. So I'm going to pull back from it. It's just enough to know that there are different schools of thought about this, about how the chosen people mindset is interpreted inside Judaism too. Forgive me for rambling, but I have to digress in order to make my point. You need to understand why extra ecclesiam nulla salus is flawed, and I believe irredeemably flawed. The problem is, the moment you take a chosen people ideology, no matter how well-intentioned you are about it, it is bound to be misunderstood. Because you automatically separate chosen and non-chosen. Calvin did this with the regenerate and the reprobate. And when New England Calvinism lost its New England Calvinism and the Congregational churches lost the theology but kept the psychology, and it turned into progressivism, we ended up having eugenics, because the regenerate were the people who led society and were worthy of leading society, and we had the reprobate. Eugenics, racial hygiene, to get rid of the reprobate, to price them out of the job market, and to discourage them from reproducing. That's what we got, a chosen versus unchosen mindset. When it is devoid of charity, can lead to monstrosity. So that's the first flaw. It inherits and emphasizes a chosen people mindset. The second flaw is it constantly equivocates around ignorance, around doing the best you can, around desire and blood and water. It constantly equivocates around these terms that either alienate people or offend people when you try to explain them to them. So we move away from that, and then there's the word church, which has a very concrete implication in people's minds. A very concrete implication. That implication is a group of people. Outside this group of people, you go to hell. That's the concrete implication. That's a pretty horrifying thought. If you want to undermine a loving God, a God that you claim is loving, that is a pretty damn horrifying thought. And if you honestly believe in love thy neighbor, that's an even more horrifying thought. So backtrack. I'm sorry I belabored this for half an hour. I should have made notes before I got into this. I didn't expect to go on for this long. I'm sorry I belabored it. But if we're to do this, we need to say, instead of outside the church there's no salvation, let's go to what is the purpose of the church. The purpose of the church is to direct people to salvation. Where is salvation found? We teach salvation is found in Christ. Who is Christ? Christ is the Logos, the rational principle ordering the universe. So we just moved from the chosen people mindset to the pagan bit. We are to align people with the Logos. The church initiates people and points people towards the Logos. Initiates people into the mystery of the Logos. And the life described by the church, teleological morality, when understood correctly, is intended to point people into alignment with the Logos and help form them in alignment, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. But salvation comes from Christ. Salvation, therefore, comes from alignment with the Logos. So you see now how we're balancing the Jewish bits and the pagan bits. We're finding that balance. But if salvation comes from the Logos and alignment, therefore, It is not outside this group of people there is no salvation. It is outside the Logos there is no salvation. The Logos. And all people have access to the Logos. Invincible ignorance is simply a way of saying all people have access to the Logos in some capacity. They just may not be aware of it, and they're doing the best they can, whether to serve God, to serve truth, to serve humanity with sincerity and truth to the best of their ability. This gets us to the active life, the contemplative life, the mixed life, as discussed in Catholic mysticism. Best of your ability. These people are accessing and aligning with the Logos to the best of their ability, and therefore the exceptions addressed under extra ecclesiam nulla salus are also addressed under extra logon. Outside the Logos there is no salvation. Because the only way these people are being saved is if they align themselves with the Logos too. All people have the ability to align themselves with the Logos to the greater or lesser extent. The reason that makes the Catholic Church stand out, well, I'm going to say the Church in general. I'm going to say Catholic with a small c here. I'm going to. Because I do not believe that Rome has the exclusive claim on salvation. I do not believe that. In fact, Rome herself has said, in the quotes I have given you, that Rome does not have an exclusive claim on salvation. Rome herself has said that. Even though she contradicts herself when facing her own faithful, with all the qualifications and the word games and the logical jumps, the fact is she does not claim an exclusivity of salvation. Period. That's what I just read to you. That's what I've read to you in Denzinger's Sources of Catholic Dogma, the Incredium Symbolorum. So I read it to drive my point home. So outside the church, well, these people are outside the church, and they find salvation too, which also causes us to redefine the word church, not group of people. Now, Catholicism defines the church as the church triumphant in heaven, the church militant on earth, the church suffering in purgatory. And because the people outside the church in life who have aligned with the Logos are invisibly united with the church in death, the church therefore must include all people who are aligned with the Logos, whether in this life or in the next. Hence, outside the Logos, there is no salvation. In this formulation, and this is what removes any doubt I have about salvific claims, but it also excludes a hard universalism. It excludes hard universalism that all people will be saved regardless. See, I'm not a universalist because I believe in libertarian free will. If God respects free will, then those people who don't want to be saved should not be saved, period. But those who are laboring to do the best they can with what they have, extra logo nulla salus accounts for everybody who is doing the best they can with what they have. Everybody who qualifies under the exceptions given by extra ecclesiam nulla salus, just says everything. But all those who align themselves with the Logos can be saved. Not that they will be, but they can be. And the more aligned they are with the Logos, the more likely they are to be saved. That's everything extra ecclesiam nulla salus says, but it's a direct assertion. It's alignment with the Logos, salvation, correlates to salvation. That's it. I don't have to insult you by calling you ignorant. Even if I don't mean it, that's how you might hear it. I don't have to risk insulting you. I don't have to run you through like a bunch of Mobius strip logical loops. I don't have to explain jargon of blood, water, and desire. All I have to say is a simple statement. And it accounts for the fact that there are people who simply will not be saved by their own free will and by their own merit. Now, this is where I differ from Reformed Protestantism. Reformed Protestantism, especially Calvinism, sees salvation as monergistic. God saves whom God will save, and is pretty capricious, especially in 5-point Calvinism. God saves them because he chooses to save them, and everybody else he damns because he chooses, because it proves his glory. God becomes a megalomaniac tyrant. John Wesley said that this doctrine of double predestination makes God out to be worse than the devil. Catholicism does not teach that. Catholicism says you're saved or damned by your own merits. And other schools of Protestantism tend to lean, they tend to lean towards God's one does all the saving. He is. But the level of cooperation with grace, different schools of Protestantism tend to have differing positions. It runs along a spectrum. Fortunately, we're not discussing that today. We're discussing the Catholic doctrine of extra ecclesiam nulla salus, which I have belabored for 40 minutes now to drive home why I find it a flawed paradigm and why I believe extra logo nulla salus is a better way to word it, a better way to speak it, a better way to preach it, and a better way to explain it to your non-Catholic friends and your non-Christian friends. Now, the downside to it, from an insider perspective, but it doesn't encourage people to convert. Well, I'm not an evangelist. This is the part where I don't care if you convert. I care if you were saved. I care if you're saved. I don't care whether you convert to my little club or somebody else's. I care that you do the best you can with what you have. If that means you're saved in spite of your belief system, so be it, so long as you're saved. So long as you're in heaven when it's all over and done with. All I care about is it can happen for you. All I care about is, okay, it can happen. You're doing your best to be sincere. I may not be a universalist, but I'm not in ministry anymore. I'm not here to tell people to convert away from your sins. Stop sinning. Stop your irresponsible behaviors. Stop your irresponsible behaviors. You're a grown-up. Act like a damn grown-up. Get your morals right and align yourself with the Logos. My responsibility begins and ends at that. I do not have to see you come into the church and receive the laver of baptism. Because as we've already established, because I do not believe Rome is the only means of salvation, and because Rome has never taught she is the only means of salvation, I don't have to say you must convert. I could encourage you because we have a spiritual and moral system that is consciously intended to align you with the Logos. But when I pointed out several times that of corruption inside the hierarchy, when I point out several times of issues within the hierarchy where they lead you away from the Logos, like demanding your unquestioning obedience and docility, that exact word, how can I advise you to convert and join an institution that tells you that you must blindly obey, that preaches the exact opposite of what they teach in the seminaries? How can I do that? I cannot. So if the flaw is, but it doesn't encourage people to convert, my answer is, I don't care. I don't care. It's enough for me to get them to logocentrism, the virtue of religio, and the transactional principle of do ut des. From that point, they can work out their salvation with fear and trembling as the Bible. And yes, I believe that salvation is synergistic. God is the one who does the saving, but you are the one who puts yourself in a position to be saved through your life. Through your life, through your spirituality, through navigating your relational matrix, and through your maturity. You are the one who merits salvation. So yes, it is synergistic. It is synergistic. Well, that's all I have to say about it. What I do hope, though, I do hope, because I've actually gone pretty long today. I did not intend to go for this long. I do hope that this helps us all with questions of doubt and disbelief, with questions of separating, whether we're separating by the Jewish and pagan bits, whether we're separating the ancient and the modern bits, however it is that we need to separate it out. I hope that the focus on the logos, the focus on truth and order behind the universe, the universal principle, I hope this helped us overcome our doubts by helping us to analyze our faith, what we believe, why we believe it, what aspects may turn us off, and also whether those aspects turn us off because there's something wrong with us that we need to balance ourselves with, or because there is something imbalanced by how they are being taught today. Because there are some serious imbalances in how the churches teach the doctrine. The doctrine may be right, but the way the churches present it can be imbalanced as all get out. And that can vary from congregation to congregation. But this can help us analyze. And we can help overcome by seeing, is it a problem with ourselves? Is it a problem with how we were taught? We can help overcome. We can help gain our balance by logocentrism rather than ecclesiocentrism, because the church is an instrument to point towards the logos. The church is not the end in itself. It is a means. Nothing less, nothing more. The ark of salvation is not salvation itself. The ladder to heaven is not heaven itself. Some of you may think I'm teaching heresy. But here's the problem. How am I teaching heresy? What heresy am I teaching? I would accuse you of heresy, of identifying the means for the end. You're confusing the means for the end. The church is the means, not the end. It is through the church you may find salvation. It is through the church's teachings and the church's practices that you find salvation. Through the church's sacraments that you find salvation. The church herself is not salvation. We are saved as individuals. As individuals who are united with the church, whether in this life or the next. That's how salvation works. That is how a careful reading of Extra Ecclesiam Nulla Salus shows it. And that is why Extra Logon Nulla Salus is the superior formation. And I will hammer that into your heads until your ears bleed, until your brain is sick of hearing it anymore. Sick and tired of hearing it. I hope that helps you to overcome your doubts. I hope it helps you to find your balance. And I hope that as it helps you find your balance, it will help you in your spiritual and or magical and or other and or mystical practice as you go along, even in your day-to-day life as you go along, by having a balanced faith leading to a balanced life. And may the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, keep our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Amen.